One lady during the time period known as the Sultanate of Women would have a longer role than any other woman as a Haseki and a Walid Sultan combined. And she has a link to this building here, the Blue Mosque, the Sultan Ahmed Mosque. It was built by Sultan Ahmed after a devastating defeat to the Safavids, and as a result, the population were very unhappy with him. And by and large, he was an ineffective sultan, and the most significant thing from his rule was the Haseki, who was ruling behind the scenes. She was called Kosem, a Greek lady, and in Turkish, Kosem means the lamb that controls the sheep. Sultan Ahmed came to the throne when he was only 13, and he had one half brother who he didn't kill, because if he did kill him while he didn't have any children, then that would have been a threat to the empire. This meant there was another heir apparent around who also had a mother who could put forward his case to succeed if and when needed, which meant Kosem would have some competition. And from now on, princes would be kept in something called the kafes, or the cage, a gilded prison, while the sultan was still ruling, so that they could not be a threat to the sultan. They would only be taken out when it came time to rule. And obviously these princes would not know much about the world and probably have psychological problems because they've been in a cage all their life, so they would be very, very ineffective. And that would mean the Haseki and the Walida Sultan would get an even greater role. More and more power was being concentrated amongst the women of the Hareem. Sultan Ahmed died at the age of 27, and he was succeeded by his half brother Mustapha, because his own son Murad was only 4 years of age. So Kosem's son and Sultan Ahmed's son got passed over. This is the first time that the throne had passed to a brother and not to a son, and Kosem was not too happy, but she was waiting and ready to pounce. The problem with Mustapha is that he had mental health problems because he'd been taken out of the cage. So he only lasted 92 days before the Grand Viziers had to remove him. And when they did, they replaced him with another half-brother called Osman, who became Osman II. The problem with him was that he was only 14 years of age, and he didn't have a mother because his mum had passed away. Kosem was waiting in the wings with her young boy ready to pounce. Osman decided he needed to legitimize himself with the elites here in Constantinople, so he decided to go to war with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Unfortunately, the Janissaries performed very bad, the war was lost, and it made him realize that actually he needed a new army. So he decided to start recruiting for a new army, but then the Janissaries realized that this was an existential threat to them. So they actually hunted down Osman, found him, and assassinated him. And the Ottoman Empire had gone from being one where fratricide was practiced, the killing of the sibling, to regicide, the killing of the ruler. As I said, more tragic than magic. With the death of Osman, Kosem put her son Murad forward to succeed as the ruler of the Ottoman Empire. The Grand Viziers actually favoured pulling out Mustapha from the mental asylum for a second rule because they thought that Murad was too young. Mustapha didn't last very long, as you'd expect, so in the end they agreed to appoint Murad as Murad IV, leader of the Ottoman Empire Sultan Caliph. But because he was very young, not only did Kosem become the Valida Sultan, but they also appointed her as the official regent, which would mean she would have all the power until Murad finally came of age. Now, Kosem would run the entire empire. She would attend the court, she would liaise with ambassadors, and she would meet judges and officials, and slowly she was gaining a lot of political experience and skills which she would be able to use for herself later down the line. After 8 or 9 years, Murad IV came of age and duly deposed his mother Kosem from the role of official regent, meaning she lost all the power and he gained it. And Murad IV surprisingly turned out to be quite an able sultan, which was an exception in the time period of the Sultanate of Women. He even managed to defeat the Safavids in the east and reclaim a city which they'd lost, called Baghdad. And in memory of that, he built this pavilion, the Baghdad Pavilion, in the Topkapi Palace. Things were looking good for the Ottomans. They now had an able sultan on the throne and there was no chaos in the Hareem. But then disaster struck because Murad died, and the problem here was he didn't have any surviving children. A lot of his boys had died in infancy. Therefore, who was going to be put forward to rule? He did have a brother though, who was called Ibrahim, known as Ibrahim the Mad, and he was in no fit state to rule an empire. He probably couldn't rule his own life, never mind an empire, but that didn't matter to Kosem. She saw an opportunity. If she could put him forward and say to the other institutions of power, the viziers, the ulama and the janissaries, that we'll just put him in place and I'll be the Walid Sultan and I'll run everything from behind the scenes, everything will be fine. And they accepted. And with that, Ibrahim the Mad became the caliph of the Muslims, although he didn't really enact any power, and Kosem was the one who became the Walid Sultan once again and started to rule the empire. Kosem kept Ibrahim occupied with many concubines, especially of the obese variety, because apparently he really liked bigger ladies, and she at least hoped that he would be able to provide an heir for the empire, but it seemed like he was infertile because he couldn't have any children, despite all these concubines. And at the same time, his bizarre behavior in the palace and around the Topkapi was really annoying the Grand Viziers, and it was a public relations nightmare. And so this great empire, the strongest empire in the world, which produced all these great rulers of the past, now was relied upon a madman mating with a fat lady just in order for it to survive and continue. Eventually he did have a son called Mehmet, and this allowed the Grand Viziers and Kosem to depose of Ibrahim, not by killing, by putting him in the dungeons, and Kosem then remained in power as the Walid Sultan. There was just one problem for Kosem. Although she had the title Walid Sultan again, which means the mother of the Sultan, she in effect really she wasn't the mother of the Sultan, she was the grandmother of the Sultan. And what that meant was that there was another lady on the scene who was the mother, who had missed out on getting the position that she dreamed of all her life. The mother of the Sultan was a lady called Turhan Hatice. She was a Russian lady, and she was quite young, and the Grand Viziers had decided to overlook her in favor of Kosem, because Kosem was a lot more experienced in politics and represented the best chance of the Ottoman Empire surviving, doing well and progressing. But Turhan Hatice, the real Walid Sultan, the real mother of the Sultan, turned out to be a bit of an ambitious lady, and she was a bit angry that for the first time the person who was due to become the Walid Sultan was not given the role. So interesting things would happen between the mother and her mother-in-law. Kosem had the backing of the Grand Viziers and the Janissaries. But after a few years, there came a time when the viziers were really disliking the fact that the Janissaries kept interfering in politics. So they decided if they could get rid of Kosem, replace with Turhan Hatice, they'd actually get rid of the Janissary influence on politics and they could just get on with their job without any hassles. So they hatched a plan that one night armed men were going to storm the portion of the palace where Kosem stayed and overcome the Janissaries protecting her and find her and execute her. So the plan was enacted and it turned out to be a bloodbath. The Janissaries protecting Kosem were overcome and the people who were on board with the plot entered into Kosem's quarters, but they couldn't find her. They looked around and they were just about to leave. And then one of them saw a dress peeking underneath a cupboard, just a little bit of it. So they decided to open the cupboard. And when they did, they found Kosem hiding. She was dragged out to the courtyard where she was strangled to death. And Turhan Hatice had finally become the Wali the Sultan. And the lamb that leads the sheep, Kosem, had finally been eaten by the foxes. Throughout this time period, we can see that the ruler, the Sultan Caliph, was selected by the elites in Constantinople. In classical Islamic jurisprudence, someone comes into power when the people known as Ahlul Hali wal Aqd give him the Pledge of Allegiance. In English, that means the people of power and influence give him the Pledge of Allegiance. And clearly, during this time period, the people of power and influence were the Ottoman institutions, the Janissaries, the Grand Viziers, the Ulama, and the House of Osman, be they male or female. And we know that because once they had made their decision, there was no resistance to their decision from places like North Africa or the Middle East or the Balkans or Anatolia. So these people were the movers and shakers for huge swathes of the globe, all centered here in Constantinople, all centered here in the palace, and during this time period much of the power was centered in the Hareem. Despite the chaos that was going on in the palace and the Hareem during the time period of the Sultanate of Women, the Ottoman Empire was gaining land and losing land. So in the end, their territory by and large stayed the same, and civil society was still running, and the empire was able to endure these 9 weak sultans on the bounce. And that's because of the great Ottoman institutions, the viziers, the ulama, the janissaries, the universities. All of them played their part and were able to keep the empire going. And remember, a lot of these institutions were either set up or greatly reformed by people like Muhammad al-Fatih and Suleiman the Magnificent, so that only adds to their legacy. Some people see the time period of the Sultanate of Women as a period of decline because there was no masses of expansion. But then other people say, well, continual expansion is absolutely impossible. And if you look at the borders of the empire during the time period of the Sultanate of Women, the Ottomans had reached their territorial maximum, and there was no more expansion that was physically capable, or very little. Therefore, they see the era of the Sultanate of Women as an era of consolidation, and it shows that. And if you take that view, you would think that the women of the Hareem did a great job in running the empire and keeping it going, despite all the shenanigans, all the plots, and all the twists that were happening here in the palace, in the Hareem. The Sultanate of Women period ended very early in the rule of Turhan Hatice, because she relinquished all her executive powers, and with that the role of the Hareem in politics completely disappeared. The Sultanate of Women period started with the Russian Roxolana and it ended with the Russian Turhan Hatice. The policy of fratricide had been abandoned, and now sultans could come and go from the throne without any bloodshed. The only question is, would they be effective sultans? And who did Turhan Hatice hand over her executive powers to? Enter the next institution of Ottoman power that would try and accomplish things that the empire had never accomplished before. To find out who they were and what they tried to accomplish, press subscribe, hit the bell button and watch my next episode on the series on the history of the Ottomans. Salam.